This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice.
We've started. This is part of the episode. Now explain to myself and Michael and the Griff and our dear Serious Danger listeners at home why you refused to listen to our podcast.
All I'm going to say is, dear listener, you're safe now. I'm back. It's okay.
They have the internet in the Philippines and South Korea, you know?
Yeah, it's just the with the climate and everything, and just because my ears and like jet lag, you know.
Right. So you flew over and your ears were popped, and they didn't unpop for the whole time.
Because of exactly.
Right.
And that's like my health and my body, and I don't really know why you would. So
it is your choice. Oh,
exactly.
Everyone's back, everyone. She's back.
Yay.
Did you miss me?
I'm back.
Oh my God.
I did. I unfortunately, as people know, I did kind of miss my little life, and that includes my stupid little podcast.
Well, it sounds like you had a lovely holiday, had a great time, and enjoyed the natural wonders of that part of the world and seeing different cultures. But it also sounds like you weren't switched off from your revolution at all. You're reading lots of books about the straight edge and organising poor radical people in white communities and stuff, and reading books about voting Labor and the Greens. What the fuck's wrong with you?
I would say that I was very switched off because I wasn't reading the news or anything. But
right.
I was reading, and what I tend to read, I don't usually read fiction. I'm going to try and read more fiction. But yeah, I did some good reading. That 2016 book, How to Vote Progressive in Australia, Labor or Greens. I skimmed it. And it was just very funny that this is a 2016 book, and there's an essay from Adam Bands in there talking about what it, would look like in a future balance of power situation for the Greens, and the possibility that actually Labor might just refuse to work with the Greens, and talking about the possibility of a quote-unquote grand coalition and Labor and the LNP just working together on things like climate policy. So maybe, Adam, that guy, he's kind of smart. I read this book. It was called Hillbillies, White Nationalists, something. I can put the name in the show notes. It was really interesting about, radical, organising of white communities in particular in the States in the, late 60s. It was kind of around and Panther era organising. Maybe a conversation that we should have at some point, because it was so, some of these groups that would organise in poor white communities would have names like White Lightning. And you're reading this and you're like, ooh, this doesn't feel good, but it was this philosophy that, groups like the Black Panthers were kind of leading and pushing, that was Black folks organising their own communities, white folks organising in their own communities, which, I'm not really necessarily sure I agree with particularly, and maybe the context has changed, but still interesting. All these groups that I'd never heard of trying to do similar work that is still kind of an ongoing project, which is building solidarity among workers.
Well, white people organising their own communities could describe much of the Greens. So I think that...
Yeah, that's... fucking hell. Yeah.
She's back!
Talk about the Greens, that bunch of idiots.
If you want the goal for life, free marijuana, vote Greens.
Really, the Greens just hate Australia.
She has described the Greens as very, very dangerous. I agree.
Frankly, I've always found the Greens to be a real serious danger to Australia.
Serious danger to Australia.
Oh, let's talk more about that on this here podcast. This is Serious Danger. It's a podcast about Greens politics in Australia. It's not an official Greens Party podcast, particularly that comment about white people. And it's made possible with the help of the Green Institute and Michael the Griff Griffin. This week, Emerald is back. We're chatting about the coming parliamentary fight over saving the world and the bits from the 2021 census that stood out to us. I realised that you were across the census coming out. You seemed quite excited about the whole thing.
Yeah, I was like, why have you not said anything about the census? I figured that's quite exciting, but I'm ready to talk more about that.
No, I love the census. We all do. When I was on Triple J, because the last census was when I was doing breakfast on Triple J, encouraging people to get involved with it, and we had people from the census on. That was the kind of breakfast show we had. People were waking up.
Yeah, very cool.
Learning about the stats. Obviously, want to say a huge thank you to Kristen O'Connell, Katan Joshi, Alison Pennington, and Stephen Bates for stepping in and filling in while Emerald was away. We love you very much. Thank you for helping us out.
Thank you.
Thank you also to the wonderful patrons who make the show possible. New patrons include Noah, someone called Meet That Guy, John Woodluck, Lauren Benson, who is a patron for €2.
€2. What's that, like $50?
That's $50, yeah.
That's awesome.
Michael, Sarah, Heath, and James. Go to patreon.com/SeriousDangerAU. Chip in $2, $3, $5, $4, $5 a month, whatever you can afford. That helps us keep the lights on, helps us pay our producer, and covers our costs. Emerald and I are volunteers. Please help us. We'd love that. Patron Deck got in touch and said, thank you for providing the show every week. It has gotten me inspired/excited to be interested in politics. Wow, this kind of reads like a spam email. Now I'm reading it back. It has gotten me inspired/excited to be interested in politics again.
I think it's very well written, Deck.
No, it's great.
You.
Thank you, Deck. I even did my first session handing out how to vote cards during the election after listening to the pod, and I'm now going to get more involved in my local Greens branch.
The email is well written. Tom's just a bad reader.
Yes. No, yeah, I am a bad reader. That's very true. But I'm worried. I love people getting involved with the Greens, signing up and joining it. I am worried that we're sending people to their local Greens branch meetings and it's going to crush their souls and they're not going to get it.
No, the branches. It's where it's at.
Are your branch meetings fun or are they okay?
I haven't been in a while. But I used to go and sometimes they would be interesting. I remember bringing my friend who's a member but not super involved. And he was like, that was kind of fascinating. If you've never seen, sometimes when there's juicy convos, it can be good.
This is the thing. And this I think, when branch meetings fail is when they are purely administrative and process driven and there is no politics involved in them. And my big thing, and I hope to try and work to change this a little bit, like in my local branch meetings, it's like people want to talk about politics, right? They want to talk about the shit that drives them to join the Greens and be involved. And even though meetings are often very long already, if you can make the space for people to actually say what they think about what's going on in the world or in the community, I think that's good news.
Don't make me a target. Don't make me a target. Now don't make me a target.
Should we jump in?
Let's dive right in. Dive into the cool, refreshing waters of discourse.
Welcome back. Welcome back to Australia. We're talking about the fucking CPRS.
I can't believe.
The 47th Parliament hasn't even sat yet, and the beloved independent MPs, our beloved Teals and crossbenchers, they're already compromising, already selling out their voters and the climate, and of course, it's all the Greens' fault. This story's been cooking for a little while. Here's a bit of background. Back in June, this is from the Australian Financial Review, we heard this. Labor and the Greens are playing chicken ahead of next month's resumption of Parliament, with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese reaffirming the government's climate change legislation will be a take-it-or-leave-it proposition. After formally communicating to the United Nations on climate change the intention to reduce emissions by 43% over 2005 levels by 2030, Mr Albanese said that target, as well as net zero by 2050, would be legislated when Parliament first sits on July 26. So the first 2 weeks of Parliament coming up are going to be dedicated to this. The coalition opposed legislated targets, which means the government need the support of the Greens. They need the support of the Greens, okay, because that's how Parliament works, who have the balance of power in the Senate. Mr Albanese again warned that there would be no negotiating a higher target or anything else the Greens want. Business groups which attended the UN signing ceremony were owed investment certainty after more than a decade of dysfunction, he said. We'll introduce legislation when Parliament sits in July. We don't need the legislation to be clear. It will be up to Parliament. Emerald, why are the Greens denying beautiful business groups the investment certainty that they deserve and that we owe them?
The Greens. Well, I assume from what you just told me that the discourse would be about Labor's unwillingness to negotiate and the fact that they said it's a take it or leave it policy and that's their approach. Is that what you meant?
No, it's the Greens' fault. It's the Greens' fault for.
But that's not what you just said. I'm just confused. I'm also confused though because I'd heard something else. I'd heard that this is a floor, not a ceiling. And so, but you're telling me now that this is about certainty. So is the target a locked in target or is it flexible?
Well, hang on. So, because you have a target, which is sort of like you say, like that's the number that we're going to try and get to. Okay, and we can be certain about that. But then, of course, if that changes, if it's a flaw and we go up, then it is pretty uncertain.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's worth pointing out that the decade of dysfunction had a bit to do with those fucking business groups using their financial resources to fund scare campaigns and to corrupt our political system.
You speak about our beautiful markets like this. Shut your fucking dirty mouth.
And then also, the Business Council of Australia has a higher target. They recommended a 50% cut by 2030. So even by business group standard,
they need the certainty of a target that actually isn't a target and is actually just a starting point. So there's a lot happening here. It's really this is going to be harder to catch up than I thought.
It's a lot to catch up on. Here's an example of the kind of positions the Greens were taking. And again, listeners to this show might be familiar with this. But here's a quote from Adam Bant. The Greens are up for working together to pass good climate laws, but Labor's already planning to undo any of Parliament's good work by opening new coal and gas projects.
True.
The emissions from new coal and gas projects, like the up to 13% increase to Australia's pollution from proceeding with the Beetaloo Basin.
Boo hiss.
Boo hiss indeed. They aren't included in Labor's modelling, which is very interesting to know. That not factoring in these massive projects.
Okay.
When this legislation comes to Parliament, we'll be pressing the government to stop opening new coal and gas projects because if Labor opens new coal and gas mines, it will wipe out emissions reductions from new climate laws and put a safer climate out of reach. So we're here to help you, Labor. You want to get to this target. We're here to help you. We want you to achieve this emissions reductions, but you can't do that if you keep opening massive projects like Beetaloo and Scarborough, which will blow our carbon budget and not let you do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
We're your friends.
Yeah. And it sounds like the Greens are actually talking about, the path to achieve emissions reduction, right?
Yes.
Like we're not just talking about arbitrary numbers. We're talking about what it will take to get there.
Yeah, well, I think also...
what, Labor's not willing to talk about that.
I'm
not making a joke.
No, totally. I mean, important to point out, the International Energy Agency says that we can't have new coal and gas projects. Labor's 43% target puts us on track to 2 degrees of warming. It is not consistent with our obligations under the Paris Agreement. There was a beautiful AAP fact check about this with Maureen Faruqi saying 43% isn't consistent with Paris. All the climate experts say that's absolutely correct. But of course, Labor's following the science.
And isn't that also not even taking into account third scope emissions, as in the emissions from coal that we send overseas and gas that we send overseas? Yeah.
Bingo, bango. Yes. No, they will continue for decades to come, of course, because the market wants it to. So we can't control the market. So I guess we sort of knew all that we knew that this showdown was coming. What has really fucked me off over the past little while is that apparently our wonderful teal independents and crossbenchers.
Oh, bless them. They'll save us.
They'll save us.
They have one issue after all. So now's their time to shine, right?
Now's their time to shine and to push Labor to be more in line with the science.
Yeah.
Well, apparently we can go fuck ourselves if that's what we think.
Oh.
New Senator David Pocock puts climate squeeze on Greens. Independent Senator David Pocock, who is very attractive, and I have no reservations in pointing that out.
Like David Showcock. Sorry.
What was that?
More like David Showcock, please.
I see. David Showcock has sent a message
not to me. I don't want any centrists to show me their cock, for the record.
This is Phil Corey saying this. Independent Senator David Showcock has sent a message to the Greens to end the squabbling over climate policy and to treat Labor's 2030 emissions reduction target of 43% of 2005 levels as a floor rather than a ceiling.
Oh, yeah, see?
Well, it's not very certain then if it's a floor and not a ceiling. It's a bit weird.
Oh, the businesses.
Pocock, whose vote looms as critical if Labor is to legislate the targets when Parliament sits the end of next month, said while there was support across the country for a higher 2030 target, we also want to see an end to the climate wars. The community wants to see us banning some gains, locking in some real progress after a decade of inaction. Do I want to see a higher target? Absolutely. But I'm also committed to pragmatic politics.
Oh,
Senator Pocock,
good.
the first independent senator to represent the ACT, received backing from the Climate 200 movement during the campaign and advocated a 60% target by 2030. This is, less than 2 months on from the election? And he was advocating for a cut of 60%. But in a speech by an interview with the Australian Financial Review, Pocock said the community wants people to be pragmatic and get on with it. This is Phil Corey writing now. Rather than complaining, as are the Greens, that 43% is insufficient, the target should be regarded as a good starting point. In the same article, Teal independent Zoe Daniel, who won the seat of Goldstein, advocating a 60% target cut, echoed Senator Pocock's sentiment. I actually think we need to kind of park the idea of obsessing about targets, she told Sky News. I think people get obsessed with what the number is rather than actually doing what we need to do.
Okay, but see, this is where I'm like, actually, I think that is true. I think it's true. I think that the focus on targets is a mistake. And like, to his credit, or to the Greens' credit, it seems like from what you just told me and from what I've seen them saying, they're actually they're not talking about the target. They're not saying, or emphasizing the fact that this target is insufficient to meet, the Paris Agreement goals or whatever. They're saying we want to talk about phasing out coal and gas. We want to talk about how we get out of coal and gas. We want to talk about not approving new coal and gas, at least.
Yes.
And like, I think it's actually quite a coup for Labor and for conservatives and centrists to make this about the targets, these arbitrary numbers that no ordinary person gives a shit about and that actually mean nothing unless you put in place the plans and the government support to make them happen. Because at the end of the day, what actually needs to happen is we need to get out of coal and gas.
Sure. And this has been the pivot that Pocock said, right? He's like, well, let's talk about the integrity of these targets. And so he's talking about the dodgy carbon credits. There's been a review announced.
Yeah.
So, but to me, this is a distraction. Of course, anyone who has committed to a target wants us to actually reduce emissions by that amount. They want any target. It's like a moot point. Of course, we want emissions to be reduced by the percentage we say it was. That's that. The scientists want that. The Greens want that. The Teals want that. Labor wants that. Okay, so it's kind of this weird side point that no one is disagreeing with you. And to me, it's a distraction. And I take your point, and we might get into it a little bit about like the political benefit of haggling over specific target numbers. But I'm sorry, to run on a platform based when you had a target, you cared enough about targets to figure out a policy around it and to run on that and to criticize other targets. And now, before we've even sat in Parliament, you're already giving up and saying, that whole target thing is all just, don't worry about it. Everybody's fine. Yeah.
But I think that, the fact that the media and the political frame has become solely, and like the debate has become solely about targets, that's bad for us. And like, I think that almost in the same way that, the Liberals and News Corp successfully oriented the debate last year around net zero by 2050. And there's the added issue with that, the fact that it's 30 years in the fucking future. And it's good that we're now actually talking about targets for this decade. But by the same token, I think like targets are very much, there's something that is for the corporate world, right? There's something that the corporate world is very much used to, is having these targets that they have to meet. And anyone who's worked in that space, or you look at that space and like bureaucracy as well, government does this as well, that they will shift things around and they will use dodgy accounting and whatever they need to meet their targets so that they tick the box in the annual report and it all looks good. And like, I find it hard to believe that ultimately, like the numbers for me, the targets kind of fit in that. And it's like, yes, we know based on the science what the targets should be, but the fight of our lives here, like the fight that we actually need to be taking on, is getting out of coal and gas. I think that the targets, the only reason, like the sole purpose of that target that Labor has brought to the election was for their base who needed them to have some climate change policy. I think that's all it does.
I don't know, man. I mean, like, Paris has targets, has emissions reduction targets. The Climate Council comes out with targets. Targets have a relationship to a measure of success.
I don't think
there's no scientific or policy utility to emissions reduction targets whatsoever.
No, absolutely,
really.
But that's what I mean. That I think it's very much a like it's that top level kind of, it's existing like the status quo way of doing politics. It is groups like the Climate Council who, they follow evidence-based scientific, policy. It's good policy. It makes sense. It's totally defensible. But like in terms of the underlying politics and what we really need to fight for material change and a kind of like transformation of our society, it's not targets. And I don't think that groups like the Climate Council are fighting for that.
I want to
It's not
targets.
their role. It's their role to work with government. Yeah, I don't know.
Right. Well, it's not just the Teals, of course. Tasmanian Senator Jackie Lambie has opened the door to backing the Albanese's government's 2030 emissions reduction target. Again, this is the Sydney Morning Herald. Ramping up pressure on the Greens to follow suit or risk being sidelined in negotiations over one of the most momentous policy debates before the new parliament. Fuck, I love the media.
Ramping up pressure.
So by it. It's incredible.
Who might be ramping up pressure?
Yes. Any decision by Pocock and the Lambie Network to swing in behind Labor's target would pile pressure on the Greens to back this legislation instead of insisting on a 75% target by 2030. Once again, I've said it before on the show, throughout all the reporting on this issue, no acknowledgement of what the science says. The impression you get is that the Greens have pulled these targets out of their butts and they're in no way scientifically informed, and no pressure or question to the Labor Party whatsoever as to how they justify their emissions reduction target being 32% lower than what the science says that we need to do.
Yeah.
But hey, what do you got?
They're factually wrong. Like, objectively, they're wrong.
They're wrong. Why would everyone listen to me about how they're wrong? But look, Jackie Lambie weighing into this debate is always great. This is a quote from her. For us, it's like, what does it look like to put in 43%? Can we go a little bit harder? And if so, what impact is that going to have? We want to get it right the first time. And if it means we can add a little bit more or we need to lose a little bit, that's what we need to look at, she said.
Yeah.
Tammy Tyrrell, the other new senator in there who could well play a big role in this, said she wanted Australia to be as green as possible as soon as possible. She said she was wary of a target that would hamper industry in a way that may imperil jobs. At the end of the day, you've still got to have a planet to live on, but you've got to be able to live on the planet as well. And families can't do that without work. I have faith that we will get where we need to be as soon as we can. And should it have a number on it? I don't think so. Let's just get as green as we can.
I mean, look, we say it all the time. Sometimes they get it so right. Sometimes they get it so wrong. This is disappointing because it's not even like they're saying something funny and stupid. It's like you just spat out a bunch of like boring cliche.
Just nothing. I went to Jackie Lambie's website and searched for the word climate and got no results, okay? They obviously had no climate policy and we're not talking about it. And, you know, if you're not going to run on it, okay, I guess. That's fine.
Well, not really okay, since it is like the greatest challenge facing our fucking generation. Like, it's an existential threat, so...
But I mean, you know, there's no outrage at the Lambie Network there because they've said, oh, they might support this target, but hey, we might need to lower it. Like they're saying, well, we'll look at the legislation and we'll need to negotiate and we will have opinions about this legislation and we won't necessarily just wave it through. No outrage, of course.
Wow, fucking obstructionists.
Well, exactly. None of that there, mainly because they don't have as much power as the Greens. So when the Greens could actually have an impact, might actually have power on that crossbench that actually determines the fate of the bill, then of course everyone loses their mind about and then they're painted as unreasonable for wanting to use that political power in order to improve the legislation. Enter your mate at Tom C. Ballard and his spicy contribution on the internet. Did you see me go viral? Did you see this?
Yeah. Yeah, I saw it, Tom. I saw your tweet.
Were you proud of me?
No, just like whenever one of my friends does well on the internet, I feel only envy, only jealousy, and begin scheming how I can go viral.
I'll give you some tips. We'll do a workshop one day.
Oh, thank you, yeah.
I should be writing my book, but I was like, no, I'll go on Twitter. That'll suck up some time. Everyone who's arguing that the Greens should just wave through Labor's 43% reduction target has to explain why the Climate Council's targets, 75% by 2030, net zero by 2035, should be ignored, please and thank you.
It's polite.
Outrage. It was very polite, I thought. Hundreds of retweets, thousands of likes, no big deal.
Hundreds of tweets.
Hundreds of retweets, many replies. I haven't been ratioed yet, which I'm really happy with. But of course, this brought out an avalanche of Labor stands and drips and people who take issue with this idea and pointed to it as evidence of the Greens being insane and intransigent. I thought I might just lay out some of the arguments. We can run through them pretty quickly. The summary of the most common arguments received to this particular tweet. First one, Labor in government, and they have a mandate to do exactly what they said.
Oh, did 100% of the voting population vote for Labor?
A majority did, according to the tweets that I received.
Okay.
Even though they had a primary vote of 32%.
Yep. Okay.
And apparently the Greens have no mandate, or they weren't elected by human beings. And apparently every other member of the parliament should just capitulate and just say exactly whoever formed government in the lower house, which entitles them to become government and form the executive under our constitution and nothing else. They still need to get all legislation passed by a majority in both houses. Apparently all the other MPs should just probably shouldn't even turn up, really. They should just let Labor do exactly what they want to do at all times.
God bless our great democracy.
Changing the target would be breaking an election promise. They campaign on 43%, and if they change that in any way whatsoever, people across this nation, millions of Australians, will be devastated that the party they voted for has a more ambitious climate policy that is in line with the science. They will be heartbroken, Emerald, and they will be betrayed.
But at the same time,
yes,
the Greens should break their election promise.
Yes, they should.
They should not stick to their policies.
Yes.
You know, and of course, Labor's never broken a promise before.
I was thinking the only times Labor develops a spine is when they're defending their shit right-wing policies. Like, we will not back down on tax cuts to the rich. We will not increase our climate policy.
We will not back down this time. Yeah.
This time.
Yeah.
The main one, of course, was it's a floor, not a ceiling, which, as we mentioned before, it goes against the logic of giving people certainty. But we heard this a lot. Okay, so it's a start. It's a good start. We can get to 43%, and then we can, try and up the ambition closer to 2030. This is what I heard a lot. Now, few things to say about this. First of all, what's the point of a fucking target?
Yeah. Have you guys ever done goal setting?
Yes. I want to be a slightly better person in 2030, and then I'll try and ramp up the ambition before I get there. You identify what you need to get to, and then you figure out how to get there, surely. This was a regular feature of Anthony Albanese defending their climate policy, saying, hey, we didn't just pluck a number out of the thin air and then try and work out how to get there. And I would argue that's exactly what you have to do. You have to see what the science tells us we have to do in order to combat catastrophic climate change, then figure out how do we achieve that goal in the most equitable way by using the resources of the state to make lives better for everybody while decarbonising as rapidly as we need to. I would have thought that would be a better way to go, but what the fuck do I know? I'm just a guy on Twitter. Secondly, I would say fundamental to this idea is that at the very least, if you set a target of 43% reduction by 2030, you are at least in some way implying that it would be acceptable for us to only cut emissions by 43% by 2030. Right? That's got to be implied.
That would be a success. But you've met your target.
We've met the target.
100% success.
And if it's about business certainty, as you say, in 3 years' time, are we going to be able to update it to 75% within 3 years? And the less time you have to meet the target, of course, the harder it gets. And this is what we've heard again and again. We've delayed. We've been so long to affect climate action that we need to make more drastic cuts more quickly in order to avert the catastrophe. That's kind of what the science has been telling us. So it would make most sense while we have the most amount of time before the end of the decade to set the climate target of what we actually want it to be in order to achieve that goal. It
would make a lot of sense. Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like I'm just ranting now. This is me reply going.
I think, like, to my mind, I guess when I'm like, oh, the target shouldn't be the focus, what I kind of mean is I think it's like, the target shouldn't be the focus of the government, in that the government should just be accepting what the target is, which, like, it's been set by the scientists. Like, they've told us what the target is. And now, the government's job is to go, okay, that's the target then. Here's how we're going to get there. But they can't even, you're right, like, they won't even just accept the target that's effectively been set for us by scientists.
By reality. Again, it's not the fucking Greens. Yeah. Okay, don't blame us, okay?
No, I know. That's what I mean.
We don't want this to be the case.
That's what I mean. Like, not to be like, oh, we need to depoliticize it. Like, we can't.
Yes.
But it's true. Like, there's a simple fact when it comes to the target. There probably is. Then there's a diversity of ways that we can get there, and perhaps we could have different like approaches, and government could take different paths to achieve that target. But to my mind, it's like the target's been set. Now the job is let's fucking get there.
The science. Very quickly, these last few. Okay, a classic one was, okay, fine, let's do nothing then. Yeah? It's either 43% or it's nothing, motherfucker.
Right.
So,
very
again,
mature.
Who's being unreasonable? Who's the ones who just won't accept a compromise? Regularly heard that Greens should compromise or Greens should work with Labor, with no details as to what they think that means. I would argue that a compromise the Greens label would be something like an emissions reduction target, but by 50 or 60%, or Greens just suggesting the fact that they are not going to wave this through without looking at the legislation and without proposing amendments and without using their ability to withhold their votes to extract concessions. All of that is unacceptable. All of that is the Greens being unreasonable. I mean, we're seriously talking about any compromise or negotiation whatsoever is being painted as being, letting the perfect be the enemy of the good or what have you. So again, very little understanding of what people think compromise or negotiation looks like in this particular scenario, in which, once again, remember, Labor needs the Greens in order to pass this legislation.
Because that's what voters wanted.
Yes.
By the way.
Yes. The Australian people elected the Senate as it is. And of course, it's the CPRS all over again. So, just a wave of people saying 2009, they're going to fuck it up again. Georgia Steele, the independent candidate, tweet saying, this is the mindset is why we've had a decade of inaction on climate change, which is just a lie and a completely inaccurate analysis of the political economy over the past 10 years. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of summed up pretty well by this Age editorial, which was just cascading the Greens for everything and saying we don't want more extreme members within the party to thwart practical climate measures put up by Labor because they don't meet some unattainable target, as they did when the Greens thwarted Labor's carbon pollution reduction scheme in 2009. The Greens need to remember Pardon?
Extreme members.
To the extreme! Extreme members. The Greens need to remember the job they were elected to do, helping Australia get further down the road to a sustainable carbon neutral future.
Okay.
It would be a shame to see them squander that opportunity. What the fuck are you talking about?
What?
What? We've got to help
we be doing?
Australia get further down the road to a sustainable carbon neutral future by voting for shit legislation that isn't consistent with the very commitments that we've made as a country that the science tells us is not sufficient to address the climate crisis?
The role of the Greens in balance of power should actually have been to employ an entire workforce of renewable energy, to actually just set up the Greens as a renewable energy corporation. Transition for coal and gas workers. That's it. We shouldn't be in Parliament. We shouldn't be doing our job as representatives.
No.
What do they want us to be doing? I'm so confused.
Whatever we're doing it wrong.
We should be out there sequestering carbon ourselves. I don't know.
By doing exactly what Labor says. I mean, look, I was reading over CPRS history this week for my a little section of my book, and it is just extraordinary, again, how dog shit that legislation was originally and how the process of voting against the CPRS and then holding out and passing the Clean Energy Act under the Gillard government was so much better. And it was only introduced a year later than the original ETS would have been introduced. And it was extraordinary. The huge investment in renewable energy, the stronger targets and the reduced assistance to industry. I mean, the original scheme was just giving out billions of dollars to polluters. If we wanted to increase our ambition further down the track, we would have had to pay out billions of dollars more in compensation to the very polluting industries that we were talking about. No transition process whatsoever. And under Treasury's own modelling, wouldn't reduce emissions for 25 years. It was dog shit. Greens opposed it and they got something better, okay? Yeah. That's the goddamn history, motherfuckers.
Yeah. And I think actually, maybe this is overly optimistic, but at the moment, my current way of thinking, I go back and forth on this, but I sort of feel like the world will find a way to reduce emissions quite rapidly. I think we are going to see an enormous transformation of the way that our society works and our economy works in the coming decades. I think what we're looking at now is what role is the Australian government going to play in that? And Labor, as a fundamentally neoliberal organisation, is saying none. And in fact, if anything, we might kind of hamper it a little. We might, increase competition for new industries by propping up old industries like, metallurgical coal instead of green steel, for example, or propping up thermal coal instead of renewable energy. And so that's really the debate that's happening. And it's also the decision that's being made is that we are going to let the free market make those changes because we know that they will move towards, new technologies, but in such a way that maintains the deep inequalities in society, the deeply oppressive economic systems, and ways of operating that exist right now, and the kind of stuff that we spoke about with Scott Ludlam when we had him on. That's the decision that's being made right now, to my mind.
Yeah. To your point before, some folks from the Greens and on the left replied to my tweet sort of making the same argument, saying, hey, targets aren't the main game here. We shouldn't go for a battle over targets because we need to keep our powder dry for the big fight, which is phasing out coal and gas. Now, again, I'm sympathetic to that view. I have no realistic expectation that Labor's going to get, even if they were to negotiate an emissions reduction target that would be anywhere near 75%. I just don't think that's going to happen. And one could argue it's not reasonable to admit that. Pointing to the 75% target as a point of science is a good argument, I think. It's something the Greens should not be afraid to do. Say, again, this is where the science is. All right, let's negotiate within that frame. We want to point out just how short your ambition falls when compared to the science. I think that's a decent argument to pull out. But also, phasing out coal and gas could well be part of the negotiations for the Greens to support this emissions reduction target. Okay, that'll be part of that could well be part of the negotiation. As you were saying, that's what Adam's suggesting. But let's be very clear. If that happens, we will be painted as unreasonable. All the same shit will be said, and it will all be perceived or represented as a way to shoot down climate legislation, when in fact we know, as you and I know, phasing out of fossil fuel industry is the main game and something that we need to definitely fight for. It's what we ran on. It's what we believe in. So, if it was an endorsement of this emissions reduction target with the idea to increase the ambition later and a serious step towards phasing out any new coal and gas projects, that would be a fantastic win for the climate. It would be substantially better than what Labor is serving up here. But I'm just saying it's like all the same fight all the same arguments we wheeled out against us if we do anything, to do our job.
That's exactly why we need to keep our eyes on the prize, right?
Right.
Because we know that we're going to be painted with this bullshit no matter what happens. It's completely illogical. It doesn't do to try and stop it, because it's a distraction. So I think, we know that it's stupid. We can call out that it's stupid, but I ain't spending any time on it. Because meanwhile, 118 new coal mines are approved under every Labor government in Australia.
Yeah. Last question. So Labor says we're not negotiating whatsoever. If we can't get it through the Parliament, we'll do it through regulation. Do you even after saying that legislating a target is good and is what you should do, certainty, etc. But of course, if the Greens, or I guess if the Teals push back on anything, or Chris Bowen says I'm open to reasonable pragmatic solutions from the crossbench without going into details, again, that usually means I'll listen to anything that I don't really care about. It won't make a serious difference. Do you think the Labor would do that? They'd pull their own emissions reduction parliament from the legislation from the Parliament rather, and just do it all through regulation? If
they can use that as a way to then, when they go to the next election, put on their materials that they were able to introduce, meet their commitment, their promise for this climate target, or meet their commitments for their climate plan, then sure, because that's all they want. All they need is to be able to say to those stakeholders who came to them and said, look, for us to support you, you need to have a climate plan. They just need to be able to say to them, yep, we did what we told you we would.
Yeah. Finally, shout out to Rachel Withers in The Monthly. Great writer. I think I really enjoy her analysis of week-to-week Australian politics on The Monthly website, and made the very good point that, of course, all this debate, all my nonsense tweeting, and I know that's not the main debate, but this whole conversation is happening while we're seeing, once again, catastrophic floods around New South Wales. I was just reading a story this morning that people in Sydney might have to reduce the amount of clean drinking water they can have, because water treatment plants have to reduce their capacity because there's they're flooded and there's all this silt getting into water. We're seeing the climate crisis all around us. We've seen it all year and over the past decade. That's the background to which this insane parliamentary game debate is happening. Mm-hmm. But she wrote, the climate crisis is why, at the end of the day, the Greens are pushing for a higher target and why several members of Blockade Australia got themselves arrested last week despite the threat of unprecedented penalties. This is more about than just mere politics, and it's certainly not about who was wrong back in 2009 and who was stealing votes from whom. The Greens are seeking to use their balance of power in the Senate to improve a Labor target that, while seemingly calibrated to win an election, was designed for a different era and which isn't in line with what the science demands. Proponents have talked about Labor's target being a floor rather than a ceiling, but as today's emergency reminds us, many people will no longer have either floors or ceilings if the world, including Australia, doesn't start to act with far greater urgency. It is, after all, an emergency, and Australia is becoming far too used to those.
Fuck.
Boom.
On the 30th of June, boys, census will be near. Then we'll fill our palms in, but there's nothing in it to fear. It's strictly confidential and easy as ABC. On the 30th of June, boys, when census day is here.
Hey, let's talk about the census.
Census. So, while Tom was apparently sleeping and didn't care, last week the ABS released its first lot of data from the latest census. Do you remember taking the census, Tom? Do you realise that it was less than a year ago that we did that?
I believe. Do you remember what time of year it was? Because I remember,
August.
I think it was in August. So we were in lockdown down in Melbourne, and I was beginning to lose my mind. And I think the census was a nice little distraction from that. And, me and my boyfriend just got to talk about our stats.
Losing their mind. I mean, we'll hear more about that in this latest data set. So yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people were doing this in lockdown. They said that they kind of saw some of the impacts of that. They saw obviously, apparently the response rate was higher. Obviously the number of people doing it online was much higher than in previous years. But yeah, we've got, they're going to release the data in 3 lots. So this lot is seems to be kind of most of the basic population data. And then in October, we get some more employment data. And then next year, we get quote unquote complex topics data, which I'm not sure all the things that includes, but it's stuff like socioeconomic indexes for particular areas. And I reckon that's potentially some interesting things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I find the census data exciting. And maybe that just goes to show that I'm a hack and I have a broken brain.
We all love it. It's great.
Yeah. When I remember,
I must say, who was it? Andrew Lee. There was that quote of, is it Andrew Lee who's in charge of it, of the stats? You know, he's the stats guy, and there was a photo of him saying the results are coming out tomorrow. I'm so excited. And that was quite cute. I must say.
Yeah. Like when I realized that we were going to get a new lot of census data, I was like, this is the first census since I've really got into politics. And a lot of time you go back to the census. Like the census really is the kind of key. It's the point of truth for this basic information about the whole fucking country and all the people that live in it. And
a big one, like, you know, when we were putting together the campaign, the federal campaign for my seat of Fraser, you know, you go to census data to get a sense of that, you know, you can divide it by electorate and you can see median income, how many people have a mortgage, the dominant professions or jobs, and the size of families in your area. Like, it really does give you a statistical analysis of your local community. And, you know, all of that does have political implications and stuff that we can speak to if we want to speak to people better.
Yeah, I think it's used a lot in like campaign planning, in, you know, defining audiences, but it's used a lot like even in the day-to-day work. I know like in my job in an electorate office, like we would use that a lot to look at how do we plan for schools, how do we plan for transport or you know, housing, all those sorts of things. So yeah, the census, it's very cool. It's very important. I think that this is exciting. And
shout out to the nerds at the ABS.
Absolutely. I love stats nerds. I have done a little bit reading through. So I feel like I'm somewhat across the data, but you can also use it to play. It's almost one of those things to be like, well, how do I compare with everyone else? Or like, is my read, and I think we do this a lot as in politics, we're trying to figure out whether like what we feel to be the truth, it actually carries in the broader population. And like,
am I normal?
Am I normal? Yeah. It's like, am I normal? And is that my perception of the world, is that true? So do you want to play a game, Tom?
let's do it. I haven't read any of your notes in the little show doc. I'm ready to go.
So you don't know what I'm talking about. I want to play Family Feud : Australian Census. So this is actually...
You're Steve Harvey, yes?
Yeah,
okay, great.
yeah. If we can get the theme music. I don't know what it's like. I've really only seen that show like once or twice on TV. Is this the one? Oh no, that's the other one. Is where you ask the question. This isn't where you ask the question the other way round, is it? What's that?
No,
Jeopardy. Okay.
Jeopardy.
Sorry.
Jeopardy,
Okay.
no.
But this one, I understand how this works. Where you're like, what's the blah blah, and then they do a survey and you pick the one that would be the most common.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of like that.
What's something that your wife is better at than you? And then the
Nagging.
husband says something embarrassing, yes, and then
Right.
survey says, and if it's up on the board, then you get points.
Yeah. Anyway, what this actually is a quiz on the Fairfax website that is just how well do you know Australia? But it made me think of Family Feud, so I'm pretending it's that. And I'm going to quiz you, Tom, to see how well you know Australia. Are you ready?
Well, I mean, I don't know Australia because I'm an inner city elite soy latte sipping green,
Out of touch.
and I'm a post-materialist. So I don't know what ordinary the working class of Australia thinks. So I guess we'll find out.
Great. All right. Let's watch you fail. So the first question. Question, and actually I'm not sure about this one, so maybe I'm not going to do as well as I thought. The question is, what was the population of Australia on census night in 2021? Was it about 20 million, about 25 million, about 30 million, or about 35 million?
About 25 million, please.
Oh, yes, that's right. Well done.
You really didn't know that?
I thought it might have been closer to 30 million at this point. I thought we might have gone up a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
What is the most common country of birth after Australia? Is it China, England, India, or New Zealand?
Oh, I think it's still England, isn't it?
Yes. Well done.
The mother country.
and actually, although, yeah, so this is one of the things that was kind of like the little headline stories that came out of the census, not necessarily, which country of birth, but the fact that now more than half of all Australian residents were either born overseas or have a parent born overseas.
Yep.
It's interesting, right? 51.5%.
And are therefore probably not eligible to run for federal parliament because they have citizenship rights to other people.
That. That's a good
50%.
point. Wow, our constitution rocks.
Yeah. You can still run if you reject it all or whatever, but yeah, 50% of more than half the population have to go through insane amount of paperwork in order to even consider running for our federal parliament. Very normal country.
I was wondering, do you reckon there were like some One Nation types who saw that figure and were freaking out, being like, oh my God, we're getting overrun, not realizing that the reported ancestry still is just like very white. Like the top 5 are English, Australian, Irish, Scottish, and then Chinese at 5.5%. So yeah, like it's that we are still, yes, a country of white migrants who colonized a country of multiple First Nations.
There's the insane debate in the UK about falling birth rates, of course, and we all know what that is code for. But there were some ideas in the UK press about how to address this. And one of the ideas was you get a telegram from the Queen for every 3rd child that you have.
Oh my God. Oh God. Let's not even talk about England right now. Those fucking insanos. Whatever you guys, what's going on there? Like, I'm just going to leave you all to it. I support it.
What's going on over there, Gav?
Oh, I don't know, innit?
Yeah, right.
Not bloody likely.
What is that?
That's my Cockney accent.
No, that's no good.
Let's hear yours.
Not bloody likely.
That's the worst Cockney accent I ever heard in my life.
Anyway, next question. What is the most common home ownership status of Australian households? Is it owned outright, owned with a mortgage, renting, or none of the above?
Owned with a mortgage, please.
You're correct. You're so good at this.
Well, I went through a lot of the 2016 census for my book that I was researching that I should have written before, but I'll now have to update with 2021 census stats.
Sucked in. I mean,
Yes.
You were saying as well, actually, you did tell me that you'd seen some of the interesting stuff coming out of the census in relation to housing, like the fact that there are 1 million empty homes in the country.
Yeah, that checks out. On census night, 1 million homes were vacant, yes. Now, I remember researching this a little bit, and there are a bunch of qualifiers and caveats, yada, 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 as to why people wouldn't be in the house, blah, 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 blah. So it's not, I don't think on every night that would necessarily be the case, or that not every one of those empty homes have a reasonable explanation. But yes, there are a shitload of empty homes in this country. It's insane. Home ownership rates amongst people under 40 have fallen by 7% rather, since the mid-90s, which sounds like maybe a small bit, but it's pretty massive. So home ownership, again, falling across the board, falling more dramatically for people under 40 and 35. We all know why that's the case.
But it's not. This is one interesting thing. Like outright home ownership is down, but actually the proportion of like ownership with or without a mortgage versus renters is slightly increased, which I didn't think would be the case.
Since 2016.
Yeah, like renters is about the same. It's still it's under 31%. And I think it might even be slightly down. Like I think that does reflect there is a very persistent government and, in general, like neoliberal emphasis on home ownership as opposed to affordability. And I also think though, like what that shift in the fact that home ownership is down for under 40s and outright home ownership is down shows that tenure type now is no longer your tenure type being, what kind of ownership status you have of your home is no longer about choice or convenience. It pretty much solely is about affordability, and young people can't afford it.
Does that also include investors though? Because remember, investors own a home with a mortgage as well.
Investors own a home.
So it might even warp, the amount of home ownership might be increasing,
but it might
be people owning multiple homes.
I don't think that's like raw numbers of homes that are owned. I think that's by person, like their principal place of residence. What relationship do they have to that property?
Okay, right, gotcha.
Yeah. So I think it's like, there's an emphasis certainly on like getting people into like increasing those numbers of ownership so that government can be like, more people owning homes than ever. Meanwhile, they're in enormous amounts of debt and people who are in the rental market are like absolutely fucked. Right. And Anyway, also, I mean, and the other interesting thing I saw, I think this was in The Guardian, is that alternative living arrangements, quote unquote, i.e. like people living in caravans and other,
Well, that is an alternative.
Is far more common, getting increasingly common, which again, for some people might be a choice, but I think for a lot of people, absolutely not. And a very scary sign.
It's nomad land, everybody. We are becoming nomad land.
Back to the game. Which of these long-term health issues is the most common among Australians of all ages? Is it asthma, diabetes, heart disease, or a mental health condition?
Oh, well, I do remember seeing something about the extraordinary incidence of mental health issues. So I'd say mental health condition.
Well done. Because this is so yay. God. I think it was around 2 million people said that they have a long-term mental health condition, which we don't know how that relates to previous years because this is the first time that the census has collected data on long-term health conditions.
Right. Well, we've been fine until now.
It was probably around, maybe 500 before that, you can say. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that changes. The other ones that are really common were asthma and arthritis, which sounds about right. Lots of people have those things.
Yeah.
The next question, which of these languages is most widely spoken after English? Is it Greek, Italian, Mandarin, or Vietnamese?
Mandarin, I guess.
I would guess Mandarin too. Yes, you are correct. Which generation has...
What do I win, by the way? I'm crushing this quiz.
You're winning, I don't know, my respect.
The greatest prize of all.
Yeah. Okay. Which generation has the most people? Is it baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, or Generation Z?
Now, well, I mean, again, another interesting story that came out of it, that millennials and boomers are pretty much tied are the same size now, was my understanding. And Gen X aren't as numerous. So I'd say it's a tie between boomers and millennials.
I don't know if it gives you that option. You have to pick one.
I think maybe boomers had slightly more.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yay. I mean,
Boo.
like, yes, there were a few articles. It's funny, like there are a few articles that are like about the shifting, like the generational shift. And it's like due to the passage of time, there are, more younger generation. There are more alphas, Zoomers and millennials. Side note, this is actually the first time I'd heard of alphas. I didn't know that was what you called them. That's people born after 2011.
They're the little kiddies. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you put together the alphas, Zoomers and millennials, that's over half the population now, I think.
This is on 9 News. They're reporting on the census data. Australia's most generous and outward-looking generation, the boomers, are about to be overtaken in number by millennials, a group often unfairly derided as narcissistic and selfish.
Wait, unfairly derided? By whom?
By whom? By the outward-looking and generous fuckers above them.
Outward-looking. Fucking hell. Okay, anyway. Now, out of these 4 religions, which one is the most followed in Australia? The options are Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, or Judaism.
Apart from Christianity.
Yeah. Well, Christianity's not on the list.
Right, sorry. I saw a story about Hinduism doing extremely well. I'm going to say Hinduism.
Okay. No, it's Islam.
Oh.
I think that Hinduism is increasing probably.
Is growing. Is it the fastest growing? Okay,
Still
right, yes.
Islam. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this because this is one of the stories that I thought was interesting. Clearly the media thought was interesting about the census was the nation turning away from God and, towards Satan and his masters. So like...
Yeah, do we know about the Jedis or anything? Were there any Jedis? Were there any Satanists?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think people do that anymore, thank fuck.
Oh.
Or at least, if we just don't give them attention, then we don't have to anyway. But a massive drop in people identifying as religious. So 38.9% in this most recent census identified as having no religion. And that's compared to 30.1% in 2016. Christianity is down, but it's still the dominant religion. So 43.9% identify as Christian. But obviously that includes, like a whole bunch of different kinds of Christianity. And that was 52.1% in 2016. Yep. And I was like, that's a pretty significant drop. And then I didn't really grasp, though, like how rapidly, in the scheme of historical change, like the speed at which this has occurred, the fact that Christianity has dropped and no religion has gone up in Australia is incredible. There is this graph that we can link to the ABC article that has this, that shows, like the lines of those two things converging literally just in the last 60 years. And it's just completely and they're so close. The lines are just about to cross over. But the fact that my mum was born in 1960, right? And in 1961, 88% of the Australian population identified as Christian.
Yep.
And it's now half that. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. And I mean, we should notice there was a campaign explicitly by the Atheist Foundation and the Humanitarian or the Secular Society of Australia. People like Tim Minchin were out there encouraging people who don't identify with any religion to make that explicit on the census because, even with that 88% figure, there's some tricky cultural things where people identify with say being a Catholic or whatever because that's what they would grow up in, or whether they go to church on a regular basis, whether God is a major factor in their life or influences their views on the world or life or policy is a very different matter. And yes, I mean, one of the things I do love about Australia is, it is seriously a secular country, unlike, say, the States, for example. Still a whole bunch of ways in which religion gets huge, massive tax breaks and has influence over our politics. And, of course, our political class is far more religious, far more conservative than the rest of the population. But, and I think it's great these campaigns are being made because people who aren't actually religious should note that on the census, because that does actually have material effects about what we know about ourselves, about funding allocations, about like it does actually inform massive policy decisions down the track. And so getting an accurate picture of where Australians stand on these questions is pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously one of the most powerful institutions in the world, but even in Australia, is the Catholic Church. And this one is interesting, particularly like because of that enormous influence and power, and because of the way that that institution seems to be just like absolutely fucking falling apart at the seams right now. Apparently only 20% in the census identified as Catholic. And this week they must have had we just had our national conference. It's like they just had their version. Apparently they have plenary as well. So you and I, we're not so different. They have their little bishops plenary where I'm sure they all sit down and do consensus decision making and, whatever else.
They want to make everyone Catholic. We want to make everyone gay and trans. Yeah, we're the same.
Yeah, live recording of their unofficial Catholic podcast. I don't know. But there was this, when I was looking at I saw this kind of pop up in the news, and I was thinking about it in the context of this census data. But the conference president of this National Bishops Conference, Timothy Costello, he did this media interview in the Oz, and he said, I think it's a very clear indication to us. This is basically just referring to the broader, the falling support for the Catholic Church. They've got falling donations. They've got fewer people saying they identify as Catholic. It's a very clear indication to us of the direction our society is going. It's not surprising, but it's a bit of a wake-up call to remind us we can't be complacent. And so they go to this conference, and I think we've seen this kind of internal crisis in a lot of Christian churches recently. So at the conference, they're on the one hand endorsing the Uluru Statement from the Heart. They're apologising to survivors of sexual abuse, but at the same time, they're reaffirming their anti-choice, anti-abortion stance. And they had a motion to let women be ordained as deacons that was voted down.
Yuck. No girls allowed.
Yeah. And there's this one weird, bizarre, I wish I didn't pull the quote, but it's one of the women from the church being like, those who toil in the vineyards should not be concerned with such positions. They shall be rewarded in other way. God, I just find this shit so fucking weird. Sorry. But yeah, there were a bunch of people at the conference who staged a protest about that vote. And Francis Sullivan, who's a Catholic but a lefty, so he would say, or whatever, does social service, that kind of thing. He told Catholic Weekly, my favorite publication, that there was, quote unquote, palpable division in the room. And I wanted to quote at length I wanted to quote him at length because I need you to listen to this and tell me it doesn't remind you of the internal crises and the kind of turmoil that the LNP was and is facing around the election. It's kind of striking. So he says, there was a lot of anger and frustration, particularly on behalf of women, but also the LGBT or rainbow community, if you will. This, to my mind, goes to deeper issues confronting the church, the party, over this period of listening and dialogue. Lots of voices have come forward, and there is frustration that all of those voices are not actually in the room. Are we actually being attentive to what those voices are saying to us? Underneath it all, I have to say, even from my own experience, there is a deep grief I think we all feel about where the church is at, not just for ourselves personally, but collectively. There are generations of people who are no longer able to identify with the church or the party. There's real schadenfreude about this.
My solution for both institutions is pretty similar.
What is that, Tom?
Abolish, please.
We have this, we're is the LNP, is the Liberal Party kind of dying? Is it on the way out? I have the same question. Is the Catholic Church going to actually die?
Well, I'll be fighting tooth and nail to prop it up. I mean, it's just bizarre. And of course, I mean, at least that's some level of self-reflection. I did see John Anderson, the former Nationals leader, go on to Sky News with Chris Kenny, because I'm a very cool guy with a lot of time on my hands. And of course, his reading these results is he sort of says,
this is the thing I would say to Australians who are dancing on the grave of Christianity. Okay, it's a free country. You don't have to believe. But ask yourself how well you think things are going. We have never been as divided. We have never been as lacking in trust in our institutions, and even perhaps certainly in the people who man them, but in our institutions. And they are essentially, of course, products of Christianity and the Enlightenment. We've never recorded such levels of depression, anxiety, of self-harm, identity politics. The senior political writer in this country asked a few years ago, Paul Kelly, are we in fact becoming ungovernable as a people? So how's it going?
Well, how's it going? Blah, blah, basically the country's gone to pot, and that's because we've abandoned God. No reflection on what these institutions are and their actions, their inability to connect with anybody. And of course, no analysis of my friend and yours, capitalism, and how, the Catholic Church in some ways, at its best, has a social justice agenda which pushes against that. But of course, plenty of conservative Catholic politicians are also free market psychos who refuse to join the dots between a political economic system which grinds people into fucking dust in order to survive, and a collapsing social order, or a sense that we don't have a community or a connection or a collective good whatsoever. Yeah. So just like don't try and change your material conditions in your life. Just go to church every Sunday and pray to God, and hopefully he'll give you a break in the next life. Just a complete inability to confront the political economic things that John Anderson and conservatives believe in, with the collapse in happiness, in general human flourishing, and the way that our society is structured in a way that fucks over people.
Yeah, and I think in these articles there was like a lot of rhetoric from the church being like, on the one hand, they're like, this is a wake-up call, we're going to kind of make changes. But on the other hand, they would be like, the Catholic Church and Catholicism and God is a gift, as they would put it. And, we can offer that out to people, and whether they choose to accept it, what they do with that is, up to them. And it's like, cool, I think people are just going to leave it. Like if you say take it or leave it, people are leaving it. So there you go.
I'm good. Yeah. Not for me, thanks. No Catholicism for me. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I like sometimes, and, maybe, who knows, maybe we are heading towards a situation where bigoted Christians are an increasingly marginalized minority in need of protection by way of perhaps, a religious discrimination bill. I don't know.
That's important.
I know there are some people who would be like, we need to be as welcoming and as tolerant of and make space for the religious beliefs and practices of Catholics and of Christians as Greens, as a party that welcomes diversity. And I think I certainly have personal bias against the Catholic Church in particular. That comes from Mum, who fucking hates them. Thanks, Mum. But like religion in particular, just because I grew up in an environment where religion was totally not part of my world. I wasn't in contact with it. I didn't understand it. I mean, apart from religious cults, to be honest, were probably the closest that I saw to religion. And so it makes me feel deeply uncomfortable, to be honest. So I know I have that bias, but I also am I think to be do we need to be more tolerant of Christians? Is being do we need to make space and be tolerant of white people? It's that's not what, active tolerance and making space is about, because these are still the privileged.
Yeah. No, the persecution complex, which probably is they love Jesus too much. It's everyone's prosecuting us, just like Jesus. It's no. You're all fine. Look, I used to be a hardcore atheist, and to the point of being obnoxious, and loved Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and did all that.
If you're religious, I'm not saying you're an idiot, but I am thinking that.
I hope that I've matured a bit and chilled out a little bit and realized that religion is still a big part of people's lives, and you can be a lovely progressive person and still have faith, and it's totally fine. And being actively hostile to that worldview is not good politics. It's not good solidarity. That's silly. But it just, we just at every instance should fight to push that out of our politics. Shout out to Lee Rhiannon, who I think took a pretty consistent stand against the Lord's Prayer in Parliament, which is still part of our Parliament, which is still fucking insane. People still have to swear allegiance to God or whatever the fuck. Like, that's ridiculous. And everyone knows that. And results like this, even religious Australians, I think, would be happily, are often quite value secularism and the separation between church and state. I think that the overwhelming majority of Australians really value that. So being able to do that, and standing the nonsense conservative criticism that says, oh, you hate Australia if you don't like the Lord's Prayer in Parliament, that's a valuable role that the Greens can play. I think that's for sure. I also think we should tax churches for the stuff that isn't charity.
Exactly. I was just going to say, like,
would make the world a better place.
From a radical left perspective, any institution, any organisation that is hoarding enormous amounts of wealth and land and is also,
for the poor. For the poor people.
Well, but and upholding the idea that provision of social services should be like in private hands and outsourced to private organisations like the church. Like that's something that needs to be dismantled. So that
can discriminate against sexual and gender minorities, which is exactly what St Vincent de Paul's or the Salvos is famous for doing.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's bad.
I almost forgot, sorry, that we were meant to be doing the quiz. We're nearly done. So speaking of, the turn away from God and the decline of the family.
Yes, my favourite things.
What is the most common marital status of people aged 35 to 44? Is it divorced or separated, married, never married, or widowed?
Ooh, married?
It is. Wow, it's still married. That's interesting. There's like slowly increasing numbers I saw of single parents. There are fewer couples, like there are more couples choosing not to have kids. And there are 25,000 new gay married couples because obviously this is the first census since gay marriage was legalized.
Yes.
But clearly people still be getting married.
Any gay divorcees?
Good question. I didn't look. I'm sure there are a couple, believe it or not. Okay, question 9. What is the most common marital status of people aged 75 to 84? Is it divorced or separated, married, never married, or widowed?
Widowed?
No, they're still married.
Oh,
still
bless.
Married. Last one. How many motor vehicles, excluding motorcycles, does an Australian household typically have? Is it 0, 1, 2, or 3?
Ooh, I would say, this might be showing my post-materialist Richie in a city bias, but I would say 2.
Really? I was like 2? It's 2. Why do you, I guess a lot of people might not, actually maybe it's less common to share a car now because more couples would have 2 jobs. And anyway, okay, your score is 8 out of 10. That's not that bad.
I'll take that.
That's okay. All right, you're a demographer.
They should ask them. Well, I guess we know who they voted for, don't we, through the election? But I suppose they should just say, "What's your favourite political party?"
What? We just did that, Tom.
Well, the census man delivers a form. I fill it out on the 30th as head of the house. But for heaven's sake, remember, don't post it. He collects it later.
I'll remember, but did you remember to put out the milk bottles?
On the 30th of June, boys, when census day is here.
All right. What is our call to action this week?
So it's NAIDOC week. Obviously, we're kind of at the end of it. But I think that have a look and see if there are any NAIDOC events in your area. Some might also have been postponed due to weather or whatever, so you might be able to get to some later. Another good thing to do is make sure that the next book that you read is one by an Indigenous author. There's heaps of great books obviously out there by First Nations authors, and just a good thing to do to support First Nations folks. We'll put a link in the show notes to a First Nations publisher so you can do that. And the other thing that I guess, I mean, maybe this is a relatively vague call to action, but I hope that it's kind of not, is in the theme of, NAIDOC being get up, stand up, show up, is to bring anti-racism to spaces that need it. So, not just like your lefty Greens circles, although actually Greens probably do need anti-racism always, but your family or your workplace, if you can, just kind of calling out racism and challenging it and like showing solidarity with First Nations people.
Nice. Look, this is specific and it's a little while away, so forgive me, but and I will bang on about it a little bit closer. But we are having a fundraiser in the western suburbs of Melbourne for the upcoming state election, 26th of November. Victoria goes to the polls. The Greens branch that I'm involved with, we really want to win the Western Metro upper house seat. This is a seat the Greens have held before. There is a decent chance that we could win it. We are raising money by having a comedy gig on the 13th of August at Kindred Studios in Yarraville. Tom Ballard is hosting. You also got Geraldine Hickey, Dirk Jayasinger, Dave Thornton, Jordan Barr, the wonderful Harley Breen, and Kirsty Wiebeck as well. It's going to be such a good show. You're going to have lots of fun people getting together, chipping in some money to raise so we can fund a really great campaign and win that seat and have a bit of a bloody laugh. I'll put a link through so you can buy tickets in the show notes. Yeah, it's called Comedy Out West on Saturday, August 13th. Please come.
Cute and fun. I think that's probably it, folks. Remember, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening now. It does make a big difference to where we kind of show up on the podcasting app. So please do that if you haven't already. If you want to help the show even more, you can support us on Patreon. Also helps to follow us and post about us on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, wherever. We're on @SeriousDangerAU on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. For all the other info, just head to seriousdangerpod.com. You can email us your thoughts, stories, love, etc. at hello@seriousdangerpod.com.
Welcome back, Emerald.
Thanks. Yay. It's good to be back.
Serious danger to Australia.